I'm going to start with a couple of personal anecdotes. The first time I ever met a self-proclaimed homosexual was when I hitchhiked 3,000 miles across America in the 1970s with a friend. This was in the days when the American Psychological Association still listed being gay as a mental illness. We were stuck in Kingman, Arizona. The sun set, and we were still hitching, eager to get to Los Angeles. A car pulled up in the dark and stopped. We lifted our backpacks and ran to it. Glancing in, the vehicle was empty except for the male driver. "I've got room for one," the stranger said. I didn't understand. "There's nobody in the car but you," I objected, confused. "I'm gay," the guy replied with memorable exasperation, his voice rising. "I'm gay." "No thanks." He drove off, and I was left to puzzle over what kind of world such a person inhabited, picking up anonymous transient strangers along the road in the night for potentially dangerous intimate encounters, somehow thinking that a random traveler with a friend might likely be game to pay such a bizarre fee alone, merely for a ride up the road. Years later, my first introduction to homosexuality in a library context was delivered by a very good friend of mine, a gay man of Mexican heritage, who I had met playing basketball games after college classes and who eventually fell in love with me. It was he who explained to me the vandalism in the lovely Powell Graduate Library at UCLA. It was and is an elaborate architectural beauty built in the 1920s or 30s. Even the restroom was noteworthy, at least then, including slabs of stone, perhaps marble, dividing the toilet stalls. What, though, were the holes someone had carved into the smooth rock? "Glory holes," said my friend, and he explained to me that some gay men enjoyed sticking their erections through them to be delighted upon by strangers in the next stall. I was shocked. This was beyond my comprehension, and in a college library? Over the years that I knew him, this gay friend hoped that I would also recognize myself as being gay, or at least amenable to some same-sex experimentation. I wasn't. He tabled his interest in this on a couple of occasions over dinner at his favorite Mexican restaurant. The idea repulsed me, and I told him so. His personal wild stories about gay bathhouses in San Francisco drove me further away from the prospect. My rejection of his proposals ultimately saved my life. My homosexual pal was a good man and one of my best friends in those days. He died of AIDS in the 1990s. One important side note about UCLA, the college I attended, and the one I'm talking about here. In 2022, the Mellon Foundation gave over $1 million to this university to create the, quote, Radical Librarianship Institute, unquote, with an aim to, quote, enable more social participation intended to push for systemic change, unquote, in libraries. Maybe the glory holes will be encased in bronze as historic milestones towards diversity and inclusion. And the first teacher listed for this propaganda agent is, guess who? Emily Dubrinsky, the self-described lesbian Marxist who is the current president of the American Library Association. The percentage of library workers who are homosexual and all the newly sexual inventions from that is hard to statistically track down, but it is common knowledge that a disproportionately high number of people in the self-described queer realm work in libraries. One 1987 academic paper claimed as many as half of all men who worked in libraries were gay. A few years later, a survey of every fourth male librarian in the American Library Association membership rosters indicated that among these men, quote, the belief that gay males predominate in librarianship is quite strong indeed among straight and gay men, unquote. Those who work in libraries ought to know. Based on the 2021 census, a British news item noted that libraries in that country had one of the highest ratios of homosexual employees of any occupation. Quote, at least 1 in 13 library assistants identified as a sexuality other than heterosexual, and 6.8% of librarians registered as LGBTQ+, unquote. Along with gay men, it is common knowledge in libraries, long known as a predominantly women's occupation, that a disproportionate number of library workers are lesbians too. And over the years, more and more LGBTQ XYZ members have become ardent activists, even militant ones, to promote, expand, and normalize their community. In fact, the American Library Association began a gay and lesbian caucus way back in 1970, the first of its kind in any national professional organization. Among its members was a pioneer lesbian named Barbara Gillings, a self-described, quote, full-time gay activist, unquote. Here's what the current American Library Association president, Emily Dubinsky, self-described as a lesbian Marxist, said about her past work in a college library.
This was one of those gay schools. I'm not sure if you have them in the UK, but at Sarah Lawrence, absolutely everybody was queer. Gender and sexual identity constituted the terrain of play.
Let's take a look at how this library gay activism has evolved into mainstream dominance these days. Case in point, the Arizona Library Association, affiliated with the American Library Association, had a webinar entitled, quote, LGBTQ plus outreach and community building, unquote, which, whatever else it's supposed to be, is propaganda, an indoctrination effort mainly aimed at the young, and seeks, of course, to expand and network the local LGBTQXYZ base. I attended this webinar. It was a lecture by a library worker, self-described as a member of the queer ranks. She works the very library from which I was fired for resisting woke dictates, in my case, the American Library Association's solicitation for librarians to join Black Lives Matter. I wanted to ask her if someone in the library is going to give a webinar for people who wish to transition out of being gay and expand their community building. That subject is something I know nothing about, except that it's a taboo, censored subject at libraries, as it is almost everywhere these days. I wanted to ask her why libraries have abandoned being neutral providers of information for all sides of social issues and are now one-sided leftist propaganda agents, pushing specific ideological agendas. I also wanted to ask her more questions, those of the sort she probably never fields, and I actually tried to, as you'll see. I wanted to test her self-described talking points to people who object to using the library to propagate specific ideologies and worldviews, wherein talking points are, of course, the rhetoric of a public relations firm or propaganda division. Let's listen and examine some of her LGBTQ community building from a public library. Of course, now this library's public policy.
So first, I want to let you all know that I am part of the queer community. I've been doing this programming for the public library system for 6 years. And it started out with me wanting to create more community and connection for the LGBT community.
Maybe there's nothing wrong with that per se, in theory, if you promote and broaden connections for communities with different, even opposing perspectives too, contrasting ideas. If you honestly believe in the hallowed sacraments of inclusion and diversity, any library should include a variety of community opinion and not just those sanctioned and promoted by ideologically driven library activists. Say, how often do you hear about a library promoting and expanding an anti-abortion community, a gun rights community, groups that believe in transitioning out of being gay, or just about any kind of community activism pigeonholed as conservative? Libraries are supposed to serve anybody, everybody, but they don't anymore. They become bases for a narrow sociopolitical activism dominantly from the political left. Here's what the hypocritical American Library Association's own Library Bill of Rights even has to say about this, quote, libraries should provide materials and information presenting all points of view on current and historical issues. Materials should not be prescribed or removed because of partisan or doctrinal disapproval, unquote. Type in LGBTQ in a search of books available at the Flagstaff Public Library catalog, and you'll find 223 books, 13,638 ebooks, and 370 audiobooks about the subject. How many of those do you think have a critical view, or a perspective less than adoring? Few, maybe none. In the jargon of queer militants, the library catalog seems like more than a safe space for them. It's a one-way street with not the smallest bump in the road. I typed in the titles of some of the best-known books per a generic Google search about transitioning out of being gay, 6 titles, into the Flagstaff Public Library catalog. None are available. The library doesn't have any of them. No surprise. This is probably the norm in most libraries. Such a subject taboo is a censored theme here as virtually everywhere in our society today. I typed in books entitled Stop Being Gay, Why I Don't Call Myself Gay, How I Reclaimed My Sexual Reality and Found Peace, Leaving Homosexuality, A Practical Guide for Men and Women Looking for a Way Out, A Parent's Guide to Preventing Homosexuality, Coming Out of Homosexuality, You Don't Have to Be Gay, Hope and Freedom for Males Struggling with Homosexuality. I don't know anything about these books, nor the topic generally. They may be garbage. Some appear to reflect conservative religious views, and for most libraries that's enough to keep them off the shelves, to censor them. But I doubt if any of these books represent actual hate, an accusation such tomes routinely face to censor them. If you sincerely believe in the concept of intellectual freedom and freedom of speech, library patrons anywhere have the right to read counterviews and decide for themselves what they are about any subject, with nothing being sacrosanct. Let's take a look at some of the more eyebrow-raising programs for LGBTQ activism at the Flagstaff Public Library.
Would the community support my programs? Would there be backlash from there? And how would I handle the backlash? What can I do when there are complaints? So creating those resources for myself to be prepared for backlash, as well as my supervisors and the library itself. As well, the other part of my experience is I work at a smaller library location, and so we get less eyes on some of the programs that we do, versus if it was at our bigger library location, there could be more resistance. I started doing a lot of the programming for our LGBT community when we were in 2020, 2021. So all our programs were virtual at the time. So there's some advantages of having just purely virtual programs. So you're able to control that space and make it safer, but also being aware that it is online, so it's harder to tell who might be asking for that link. So being always aware of creating the safe space and having guidelines for that.
One of the most controversial programs was something called a name change clinic, wherein people as young as 12 were advised and counseled without parental alert or involvement into the legal process of name changing.
The name change clinic is something I've been doing for the last 2 or so years. I work with 1 in 10 and a local law organization in town to be able to provide one-on-one help with the name change process, what forms they're going to need, how much is that going to cost. And we partnered with 1 in 10 because they were doing that already. So that means we even got people that are outside of our community, so outside of our county, we were able to help as well. Working with 1 in 10 because they also provided the financial assistance for those within 12 through 24 age group. So with that, they were able to provide financial aid, which is one of the biggest hurdles, but it was limiting in the sense of the age group. But they are able to provide recommendations sometimes for other groups that provide financial assistance as well. So having the partnerships really help advertise the programs, but also strengthen being able to offer more. So I'm able to reach a wider audience since I had the partnerships. The name change clinic, I had a parent one year call because we had advertised it, I believe, at that time for ages 12 and up. And a parent had called because they were upset that they weren't invited to be a part of this conversation. They were welcome within the age group. It didn't say like parents were excluded or in any way, but they felt like a teen could just come in, decide to change their name, and it would just happen. And like that isn't what happened. And so I explained that they were welcome to attend the program, to learn about this process. We explain what the process is, and then people can ask questions. And like that a parent kind of has to be present in some way, because for a minor to change their name, they need to have parent involvement. And that process can be complicated and different for different parts of the state. But like parents are generally required to be with their minor in the name change process. But any teen is allowed to learn about that process, just like any of our other programs. So we had a complaint about not having actual language that said parents welcome or encouraged to attend. We wanted to make it all ages. And so it was shared with our schools in town, and they got some backlash from parents there. And so that ended up coming to the city, and we had to close off our name change clinic for that time. However, since I have strong community partners, we were able to still do it, just not library involvement. We were able to still have the program happen and be able to refer people to it, just when it wasn't allowed to be library involved. And since then, we have more talking points and advocating for why we should be able to be involved in a program like this. And so I have that in the resources as well, kind of explaining like why you want to keep so many talking points, those strengths. I was able to keep doing the name change clinics because of all the partners I've made. I made those connections. I have those strong network. So partnering up, whether it's with your supervisor, whether it's with your coworkers, having a team of people you can go to for when things happen is important.
Public libraries are taxpayer supported and are supposed to be nonpartisan and not political. So what talking points can she pull out to back the fact that library-sponsored products were sent, as she says here, to politicians both local and statewide if an expressly political interest was not the reason? I'd like to hear her answer.
The postcards made with pride was a collaboration with our university library, and we were creating postcards to be able to send to political figures in town and the state to be able to be like advocating for yourself. So kind of learning about that process of like, what is laws? So people were able to make the postcards and then send them if they choose.
I was fired from her very same library for resisting woke dictates. I once had a conversation with a woman who worked in the children's section of this library. She was present when a homeschool mom phoned to ask when all the gay propaganda posters were coming down for Gay Pride Week so she could bring her kids to the library.
I mentioned the LGBT+ book club. It started off with being for 12 and up to try to create more mentorship opportunities between adults and teen youth. So that way, those teen youths who are still learning about their identity can still learn more about it from someone who's lived through it longer. Resources. So we reached out to GLSEN as well, which is an organization that focuses on K through 12 schools. And so they have some resources as well. So we were just working with a few different organizations to help people feel comfortable coming out. And if they're not, making sure that they are comfortable when they do decide to, if they decide to. The drag story time, it is exactly that. We have a drag queen or king to tell a story. It's been done in a few different ways. We've worked with AZ Drag Story Hour, they'll usually do songs and stories just like any other story time. But it's fun because we have someone that's in costume. As usual, we've had resistance against doing a drag story time. Just about every year that we've done it, we've always had a parent group send emails in to us. But with working with my supervisor, we had talking points prepared for other supervisors and the other head departments, explaining, why we are doing this program and like what advantages does it provide to the community. Why would we do this? And we also share that with our front desk staff to share that as well. They feel comfortable explaining the reasons. We also give them the tools of, hey, you can always send it to your supervisor. So the supervisor can talk about the program. If you do not feel comfortable talking to this person, you can always pass it up.
At the beginning of this propaganda webinar, the moderator from the Arizona Library Association said there would be time for questions at the end via the chat venue. I typed in my question, sent it, but it wasn't an acceptable question, so she ignored it.
Webinar participants are going to be in watch and listen only mode. If you have any questions during the presentation, just put those in the chat at the bottom of your screen. We'll have time at the end to go back and answer any questions that you have.
Here's what I wrote. I was fired as a librarian for resisting woke indoctrination. I have a YouTube channel called The Fired Librarian. Will you give me an interview? With tough questions. In the name of intellectual freedom, I was fired from your library. In the end, in overview, what kind of country are we becoming when people are afraid to voice their opinion against a well-financed, dominant, increasingly omnipresent, and activist political collective to which many individuals today secretly object, wherein legitimate criticism is decreed and institutionalized to be irrational, bigoted hatred and routinely censored and punishable? The issue, as always, isn't hate and bigotry. The issue is freedom, liberty, and the right to criticize anything and anybody in a once open society. But one last thing. Let's conclude with a zinger. Let's talk about pride, gay pride, homosexual pride, LGBTQ pride, and the increasingly crazy diversity inclusion ideology and the amorphous sexual amoeba nuttiness that informs it. I used to be a photographer and videographer, and I documented hundreds of events in my lifetime, most of them in the Los Angeles area. In 1996, I videotaped a big gay pride parade in the homosexual enclave of West Hollywood. Nothing is presented out of context here. It was an official gay pride parade and tens of thousands attended. It was very much a hedonistic and exhibitionist enterprise, a kind of gross caricature of personal liberation, in retrospect, a kind of milestone for today's diversity and inclusion obsession. Among the participants was a float promoting sadomasochism with a group of men whipping each other as their float tooled down the road, another guy enduring hot wax. Bear in mind, again and again, this nonsense was officially sanctioned under the gay pride umbrella. I don't care what anyone says. I see nothing here to be proud about. It still disgusts and disturbs me, always has. And this S&M float is iconic for all the madness about what the diversity and inclusion steamroller has become. After all, how could the gay pride bunch turn down anybody? If openness and the secular sacrament of tolerance must, at all costs, be emphatically championed, and any moronic enterprise must be afforded respect and a place at the table because no one is allowed to discriminate against it. Where do you draw the line? Is there a line when diversity and tolerance slide into very troubling zones, into madness, into self-hurt, a celebration of other people's pain and self-destruction? And yet, who dares criticize anything sanctioned and hallowed as gay, lest they be defamed, harassed, and persecuted? This was the 1990s, and the breakless inclusion bandwagon has surely expanded even more now. But I wondered then, as I still do, where is our society going with all this nonsense? What is there to be proud about when a bunch of men torture each other for some kind of bizarrely twisted sexual satisfaction in public display, a self-indulgent and self-destructive spectacle, intentionally hurting and damaging each other as an officially sanctioned expression of gay pride? To each his own in a free society, but the celebration and solicitation of just about anything under a very censorial ideology called gay pride, which is increasingly institutionalized as sacrosanct and immutable, even in a public library. Let's be honest one time. Perhaps that day's Pride Committee for that parade, whatever it was, whoever it was, decided that the term tolerance could be so liberally translated, widely enough, degrading enough, hurtful enough, evil enough, to understand the dictate of tolerance to be also a tolerance for pain.